MK here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. Well, if you watch the news or read magazines regularly, you may have come across a segment or an article highlighting the fact that men in America, and basically men in the West and industrial societies, just aren't doing very well today. For example, we hear statistics that fewer men are going to college today, and those that do are performing worse than their female peers. Fewer men have been hit really hard by this recession, and a lot of men are unemployed today, and men are actually earning less money today comparatively to women in some areas. But why are men falling behind? What's caused their decline in the past 50 years? Many sociologists argue that the driving forces are economic and cultural in nature. But our guest today disagrees and proposes that biology, or rather humans messing with it, is the main force behind the decline of men in the West. His name is Dr. Lionel Tiger, and is the author of the book The Decline of Males, the first look at an unexpected new world for men and women. Dr. Tiger is the Charles Darwin Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University, and he has written several articles and books on how human biology affects human social interaction. Well, Dr. Tiger, you wrote a book 12 years ago called The Decline of Males. In what ways are men in decline? And does this decline that you write about, does this cut across cultures, races, socioeconomic groups?
Well, the diagnostics of decline are fairly clear. For one thing, the number of males who, for example, lost their jobs during this current recession is about 82%. And women did better out of this disaster than men have, and that's the first part. Secondly, if you look at marriage rates, you see the extraordinary number, and this applies to the U.S. as well as other industrial countries, that 40% of babies are born to women who are not married, which means they don't have husbands, which means that the potential husbands don't have children, not legally in any event. Now, a lot of these babies are born to affectionate couples, and it's not as dire as it may seem. But the fact is that, as I point out in The Decline of Males, men are becoming outlaws, not in-laws. And they're not joining families, and they're not having what we know to be, in comparative health terms, an advantage in life, which is having a stable, affectionate kind of environment, which has its problems, but nonetheless is better than the alternative, which is singlehood.
And it seems like
and if I may just go on, if we look at income statistics, we see that in large cities, among younger men and women, say between 20 and 33 or so, women now earn much more, or not much more, but they earn more money than men. Secondly, and more importantly for the long run, if we look at educational statistics, we see that there's almost a breakdown of 60-40 women graduates to male graduates. In some places, it's even higher. So women are graduating from places which give them credentials. Men are not. And the question then becomes, who do women marry? We know that women tend to want to marry guys that are a little older and a little richer, because most women are going to be out of the labor force one way or another from between 5 to 8 years. And so they want somebody to give them a hand, usually when they're having children. Well, who are those guys? They're not around. And as a consequence, we see the situation I mentioned, which is women decide to have babies on their own.
And so that problem, that's, in your opinion, is a problem for society, when there's no stable family.
Well, we have every piece of data we have about criminal behavior, drug use, suicide, etc., indicates that the single male is at great risk. And the children of women who are not married are consequently also at great risk, especially the males.
Interesting. Well, so you wrote this book about 12 years ago. It was published in 1999. In that time, since then, have things gotten better or worse for men? And are there any specific examples where things have gotten better or worse?
Well, they've gotten worse, in my opinion, principally because the sort of feminist groups like the American Association of University Women and National Organization for Women really control the dialogue. And as we saw in the White House recently, President Obama announced with great pride a White House Council on Women and Men, on women and girls. There's been some pressure to get an equivalent council on men and boys, but with absolutely no success, because there are some people who really don't think that guys need anything. They've had this alleged 5,000 years of patriarchy, and it's women's time now. So if you look at all these sort of national data, the affirmative action for women, which has gone on to this day, even though it's no longer necessary in many places, we can see that things are harder for men than they have been. And there are other factors that don't seem to be immediately important, but are, for example, at my university, Rutgers, and at countless universities in the United States, the first day of class for men and women is a rape seminar where the guys are described in effect as potentially predatory and the women as potential victims. Now, that's obviously done to cover the backsides of the lawyers who don't want a rape case and a lawsuit. But the fact is that it's humiliating to both men and women, and they go through their college experience with this initial impression of who they are, and with no basis in the facts of life of the people who are in the room. This is all national statistics, and a lot of it is simply irrelevant to the people who are there, who are mostly nice kids.
Well, so in the past, it seems like in the past 4 or 5 years, there's been an explosion of literature. There's books, been magazine articles. There was the Newsweek feature about the state of men. The Atlantic Monthly had that article, The End of Men. There's so many books about just the state of masculinity in America. And these books, usually when you read them, they give these different sociological and cultural explanations for the decline of men. But in your book, you actually give kind of a unique argument. You argue that the driving force is that men have been alienated from the means of reproduction. What do you mean by that?
For the first time in human history, possibly in mammalian history, one sex can control reproduction. And the advent of the pill, which was a great drug, is a great drug, and very important for any number of reasons, women could now control whether they would be pregnant or not. Guys had no idea and still have no idea. In the 50s, before this decline began, the principal contraceptive that was available was the condom. If you didn't use a condom and you were with a fertile-aged female, there was a reasonable chance, maybe as high as 20%, that any act of sex would lead to pregnancy. And so we had a whole series of devices ranging from the shotgun marriage to pressures on men and women to marry during a pregnancy. And we know from parish records and other sources that between a third to a fifth to a half of marriages occurred with a pregnancy. You just look at when the marriage occurs and look when the baby's born. So that was a way that women and men somehow engineered getting together and having children. After the pill came in the 60s and 70s and up until now, men became, as I said in The Decline of Males, alienated from the means of reproduction because they had no way of knowing what the hell's going on. And they depended on females to tell them, as should have been the case. Women have a major issue with reproduction, much more so than males in a kind of ongoing sense, and women should control this kind of thing, but it does mean that males don't. And so I completely fail to understand why others who've written on the subject don't understand the absolutely critical consequence of change in the contraceptive technology, which has had this phenomenal effect on men all over the world, not just in the United States, but everywhere. So while sex has become easier for men and women to have because of the facility of the pill, it has meant that there's been this disruption in the pattern of men engaging with a woman and having a child and then spending a lifetime or part of a lifetime dealing with the consequences in terms of providing resources, protection, affection, and the like. So I think that this is a biological issue much more in a way than it is an economic issue, and partly the reason for people not understanding that is that nobody really understands biology, or given the people who are creationists, they think it doesn't even matter, which is complete nonsense and irresponsible.
So, I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about some of the work you're doing in the area of academics as far as men go. You're part of a growing group of academics who are promoting what's called, I guess people are calling, male studies. It's a curriculum at universities. But how does male studies differ from the men's studies you already see at campuses across the university? What's the difference there?
Men's studies, I think, are a wholly owned subsidiary of women's studies or gender studies. The women have taken over this area in the university, and nobody can shake them. So if you look, for example, I was in Toronto giving a talk, and some journalist at the University of Toronto looked at the faculty and the course offerings at the University of Toronto, which is a major, very big, well-funded university. And he found that there were 40 courses on women's studies, 2 on men's studies, one of which was about transgendered people, and the other was on gay males. There was not a single course at a huge major university, which is possibly the leading one in Canada, that deals with guys just doing their lives. But there were 40 on women, and again, that's perfectly fine. You could say, and it has been argued by many women's studies people who are often excellent academics, that for the longest time things like history and political science were essentially the stories of men. Well, now it's gone the other way, and so some of us felt we had to redefine how we categorize and characterize males so that they're not put into a box which is all too common, that they're kind of defective females. And so you have a bunch of people writing about how the real challenge is to make men more sensitive, to make them more express their feelings, etc., all of which will fail as it's characterized, and which doesn't deal with the fact that males and females are very different. They have different rhythms and cycles in life, and you can't, by announcing it, claim that men and women are the same. That is completely counter to everything we know about human biology.
So, what kind of I guess disciplines would be covered in male studies? It seems like women's studies, it focuses a lot on sociology, cultural studies. Would male studies be similar to that, or would there be more or less than that? What's the?
Well, that would be part of it. Of course, it would have to be. But then we also want to begin looking at other male primates, because you can learn a lot from watching the chimps and the baboons and how other primates manage their lives. And they have sharp sex differences often, but they work. It works. So that would be one way. Another would be to look at men's health. Generally, the diseases and difficulties men have are far less copiously attended to by researchers. So breast cancer is a favorite one, but prostate cancer, I believe, kills more people. And a male studies program would begin to look straightforwardly at what affects guys and what is the reason for some of their difficulties. There is at Columbia a program run by Dr. Legato, who recently got a very large grant from the National Academy of Sciences, or I forget which agency, to study men's health, and that's the first time. So, and she is in fact going to take part and be one of the co-chairs of a meeting that the Male Studies Group is having at the New York Academy of Sciences in a few weeks. And that's a good sign, but it's taken years to get to this point because initially the response of women both in the medical and in the governmental areas was to say, well, men don't need any research. It's women who suffer the various disabilities, etc., even though on average women live 7 or 8 years longer than men.
So, Dr. Tiger, one of the criticisms levied at women's studies programs is at universities that they have been overridden, that the educational goals of women's studies programs have been overridden by the political mission of feminists. Do you think a male studies program runs a risk of becoming politicized instead of focusing on rigorous, objective research?
Well, it's quite possible it could, but hey, give us a chance. And there's no reason to believe that we're doomed at the outset. I certainly don't think so, and I know many people who are involved in trying to have a federal attention to boys and men who are not politicized. They're actively concerned about the number of men who don't graduate from educational institutions, who are incarcerated, who commit suicide, who are drug users, who have no access to children. This is not a political activity. It's a sharply humanitarian one, and it's about time the people on the other side, if you will, of the gender divide, the feminists, stop accusing those concerned with the males of being partisan.
So, kind of in the same vein as this, there's male studies, kind of a growing trend for male studies to be placed in universities. Alongside that, there's a small but growing men's right movement in Western countries. That they deal with a variety of issues, fathers' rights, false rape issues, discrimination of men, in the workplace, etc. What are your thoughts about this growing men's rights movement?
Well, it's obvious that, for example, the divorce courts are a slum, a moral slum by and large. There are countless cases, and I know people who haven't seen their children for 15 years, guys, because their wives claimed, rightfully or wrongly, that the guys were abusive. A summary judgment was entered in the court, and a judge made a decision at a hearing, very often at which the male is not even present because he doesn't know. And the state loves it because it means that then they can collect child support from the guy and rather than from the taxpayers. And so it's part of a major conspiracy which has punished countless men. And while obviously divorce is not a happy result for women either, and many women have suffered tragically through divorce, nonetheless, there's no reason for the antidote to that to make men suffer. So there is this very large group of men, many of whom try their best to pay child support, but then they lose their jobs, as countless millions of men have done recently, and they can't pay child support, so they're put in jail, and they keep running up their bill plus interest, and they're doomed. There's nothing they can and will do. They may try to leave the state, but that's now become difficult with the ways that the governments have of catching these guys because they see them as revenue sources. And as we all know, governments want revenue more than they want justice.
And it seems to me that this men's right movement, it's very splintered right now. I mean, there's all these different groups that have different, I guess, goals, and there doesn't seem to have been a coalition of men like you would see like with NOW, the National Organization of Women. Do you think there would ever be a male version of NOW, or is there something about the psychology of men working in groups, which you've written about, one of your first books you wrote, that would prevent a large group of men, organization of men getting together fighting for men's rights?
One of the problems with that is that guys are not that interested in talking about themselves. There was for 5 minutes men's consciousness groups, but guys just don't want to sit around talking about their feelings. They couldn't care less. They want to get something done. And so if you remember, the origins of the feminist movement had endless consciousness groups. I remember friends of mine who were writers sending in articles to Ms. Magazine, and they couldn't get an answer on whether they were going to use it or not for months because there was a big discussion going on, and all of the decisions were taken in a circle and so on. Guys don't do that. And as a consequence, there's been a failure to connect in this way, which has effective consequences. I'm not wholly optimistic that this will change, simply because I think it's in the nature of guys to want to get things done, not get things discussed. And in this realm, discussion is the first part of action. And I don't know if there are enough guys who are willing and able to do it in a systematic way. There are some who are. I know many of them, and there are heroic characters trying to figure out how to take the next steps to protect half the population from, as it were, the other half, which has got a very, very good network, thank you very much, for protecting itself. So, again, as I said in The Decline of Males, guys sort of look on and they're baffled about why this is happening to them, and they're at first vaguely irritated and concerned, and then of course if things keep getting worse they become devastated, and then they become dysfunctional, and that's going to be hard to change. Remember, the argument has always been that men are all powerful and males can do whatever they want and women can't. It's obviously not true in this area.
So what is your answer then to them, kind of dovetailing off that your last statement there? What can be done to end the decline of males? I mean, is there any changes we can do? I mean, is the first thing has to happen is a discussion amongst men about this before anything can happen, or are we just, is there no hope for the decline of males to end?
No, there's always hope, because first of all, there's always a crop of youngsters coming through, and they want lives the way that they want, not ones they've been forced to have. There's some change. I suspect that in the next election we'll see some interesting changes, because it appears still that the White House hasn't figured out that one reason why they did so badly in the last election cycle was that white men just wouldn't vote for Democrats. And they won't again, because they don't see the the Democratic Party, with its sort of Nancy Pelosi cast of characters, has the interests of working class males at heart. But 80% of single women voted for the Democrats, because this group precisely meets their needs. Now, I'm not taking a political position here. It's not my job. I'm not that interested in taking such a position. But it's quite clear that there will be, and there's already a realignment, which Obama called a shellacking. Well, it wasn't a shellacking as much as it was a big shift in the gender patterns of voting. And as we can see in the fights about unions, working class men for whom the unions were always strong supporters are losing out. And that probably will begin to have some effect on politicians. I know that some of the people interested in this male studies activity are trying to begin a meeting of minds with politicians in both parties without being exclusively one focus or the other, because it's got to happen. So just out of the self-interest of the political parties, who are ruthlessly self-interested at all times, we can assume that there will be some shift here because people vote.
Well, it's kind of interesting, too. I mean, just you brought that up. I was trying to think, where would men go? Because it seems like the only other alternative we have in America is the Republican Party. I mean, where would men go?
Well, they'll go to both parties. Remember that there are a lot of very baffling things going on. You have Michelle Bachmann, who's now threatening to run for Congress or the Senate, maybe even the presidency, who makes Sarah Palin look like Simone de Beauvoir. So you've got some realization that on both sides of the aisle, which there shouldn't be anyway, not on this issue. We don't need an aisle. We need a connective tissue. On both sides, there's a real need to do something. When my Decline of Males book came out, I was surprised, and I shouldn't have been, that the warmest and the most vociferous response I got was from the mothers of boys. The mothers of boys kept telling me, you don't know what's going on in the schools. You don't know what kind of slum emotionally my son's forced to live in, because of all these teachers that have been instructed only to recognize the girls, to push the girls into math and science, and for which the government pays huge sums of money for no particularly good reason or to much effect. And I think that's going on a lot. Mothers of boys are irritated, and parents of boys, not just mothers, because they can see what the consequences of this feminist issue has been. Now, the feminist initiative was very worthwhile and remains an important element of our national life, but it's come at a considerable cost to the boys that are failing out of school and being drugged. One of the things I simply don't understand is why so many boys, and 90% of the victims of Ritalin are boys, are given drugs to try to essentially turn them more into girls for behavioral purposes. And they're giving this very powerful drug to kids that are barely 3 or 4 or 5 years of age. Ritalin in France is an illegal drug. It's a highly controlled drug, and this was about 10 years ago. I was told by a professor at the University of Paris Medical School that there are only 4,600 prescriptions given for Ritalin in all of France, and it's for adults. But we're just having school nurses and doctors giving these drugs out to people because teachers find boys that are medicated easier to deal with.
Well, Dr. Tiger, we are running out of time, but before we go, where can our listeners find out more about your work?
Well, the most direct recent is The Decline of Males, which is in paperback and it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on. And through Google, put my name in, and there are references to some articles I've written, which can be useful for anyone trying to look at this freshly and empirically and decide how to proceed. So, I'm not exactly a worldwide figure, but I'm not exactly inconspicuous either. And if somebody wants to go into this, there's ample opportunity for them to do so. And as I said, I think the most efficient ways for $12 or $15 or whatever to get a copy of many groups, or go to The Decline of Males, and go to the library and read it there.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Tiger, this has been an interesting conversation. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure as well, and good luck with what you're trying to do.
Our guest today was Dr. Lionel Tiger. Dr. Tiger is the author of the book, The Decline of Males, and you can pick up his book at Amazon.com. That wraps up another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. For more manly tips and advice, make sure to check out the Art of Manliness website at artofmanliness.com. And until next time, stay manly.